Hello students, here is the narration for the cardiovascular system. This is the second one for this week, the heart. So this is looking at the anatomy of the heart, which means its structure. You'll be expected to be able to label all parts of the heart. Then we will look at how blood flows through the heart. We would look at what is also called the cardiac cycle, how the valves function, etc. So there is a lot of information here, even if the slides are not that many. So take your time to move slowly from one slide to the next, making sure you understand the previous slides, the concepts. At the very beginning, I think you should stop the narration when you get to the diagram of the heart and learn the parts of the heart first. That may take a day or two, and then move on. You will find it a lot easier and less frustrating, because then when I refer to certain parts and certain structures, you will know exactly which ones I'm referring to. Okay, here we go. So the human heart, let me get a pointer, is roughly the size of a closed fist. That is generally mentioned, agreed to. But more importantly, it is divided into 4 chambers. There are 2 upper chambers and 2 lower chambers. The upper chambers are referred to as singular atrium, plural atria. Bottom, ventricle or ventricles. The atria and ventricles are separated from each other by a valve, which we will come to learn. They are called the atrioventricular valves. AV valve for atrioventricular. It also says here that each atrium and ventricle is separated by a valve, and each is also connected to a blood vessel, whether being an artery or a vein. So this is text-based information, which probably doesn't mean very much to you right now. So when we get to looking at the diagram of the heart, this will make sense. The heart is responsible for circulating blood around the entire body, so it is important. There is a lot of muscle, and the type of muscle that's found in the heart is cardiac muscle. So not skeletal, not smooth, but cardiac. And the walls of the heart, really, there's an outer layer, but the walls, the major part of the structural component of the heart is actually muscle, which is what allows it to contract and pump blood with such force that the blood will flow all around the body. So this is sort of a big picture look. The heart within the thoracic cavity. You do want to pay attention to this type of diagram because we also have the respiratory system coming up that we need to study. And based on my last narration, as well as your own common sense, you know that the cardiovascular system is connected to every single organ system in the human body, because all cells require oxygen, which is transported in blood, nutrients, amino acids, fatty acids, and glucose. So this is a look at the thoracic cavity. So again, the thoracic cavity, the 2 major organs are the, now let's put right. So that's the right side. This is the left side. So we have a right lung and a left lung, which are part of the respiratory system. We see here a right atrium, so that would be the upper chamber right there, and a right ventricle. This is now the lower chamber on the right side of the heart. We have a left ventricle being shown here, and the left atrium isn't actually visible because the way the heart sits in the thoracic cavity, this is considered the apex of the heart, the pointed portion, and it points actually towards the left hip. So the heart doesn't sit in the middle. I know diagrammatically, and for ease, even when I'm teaching, I would draw a heart the way, you know, you see heart shown in birthday cards and that sort of thing. But it isn't really like that. And we see structures here called auricle. These are little flaps of tissue that actually sit on the outside of the atria. So the ribs, which make up the thoracic cavity, they're shown cut. And below, separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. Now this you should know from our study of skeletal muscles. That's the diaphragm. So the diaphragm, a very important muscle for breathing. So we can look at this diagram again when we do the respiratory system. Only in that time, we will be focusing on the lungs proper. Now, other structures that are shown here. So again, we have red usually if the anatomical structure comes in contact with oxygenated blood. Blue if it comes in contact with deoxygenated blood. So we know that the aorta is a major artery, the largest artery, and it is coming, or you can think of it as being attached to the heart itself. So what we will learn is that the left ventricle here pumps blood directly to the aorta. On this side, we have the superior vena cava, which you learned from blood vessels, is bringing deoxygenated blood from the head, neck, shoulders. And so that blood is going to flow into the right atrium there. And it's shown in blue. This here would represent the thyroid cartilages, and this is the trachea or windpipe, the blue rings that are being shown there. Those are all part of the respiratory system. This area that's shown in dotted line, so right around here, is what's referred to as the mediastinum. Media means middle. So it's kind of middle of the thoracic region. And the heart, the blood vessels, there's some other structures that are found in the mediastinum, but I don't think you have to worry about that right now. Now, what is also shown here is the heart sits in a sac. And the sac has two layers, an outer layer and an inner layer. The inner layer touches the heart itself. And the outer layer is what's shown here, edge of the parietal pericardium. So the pericardium is the sac essentially that the heart sort of sits in. Between these two membranes is a little bit of fluid, and that's what's called the pericardial cavity. The fluid there helps to reduce friction between the two layers of the sac when the heart beats. So whenever there's movement, there's a risk of membranes rubbing against each other, which again, just like we don't want bones rubbing against each other, we don't want membranes rubbing against each other. And so one other feature of this sac that the heart sits in is that it isolates the heart from the lungs, because the lungs have their own membrane. Their membrane is called the pleura. So you see here, this is kind of shown, you know, edge of pleura cut. It's the same relationship. There's an outer membrane and there's an inner membrane for the sac that the lungs actually sit in on both the right and the left sides. So this way also, if there's an infection, let's say in the lungs, it is isolated, it is kept in the lungs, and it's not easy for the microorganisms to migrate and come over to the heart. So that's the big picture. Now this slide shows a little bit more about the pericardium, which is the sac that the heart sort of sits in, and the layers of the heart wall. Well, let's see how much of this you need to know. So the heart is contained in an outer transparent sac, known as the pericardium. Definitely you need to know that. The muscular walls of the heart is known as the myocardium, right? Myo means muscle, cardium means heart. So where is the myocardium? This is what you want to appreciate here, this width. So the thickness there, that's the myocardium. That's the cardiac muscle. That is what actually has to contract and relax. So all of these are coverings, essentially, with the epicardium being the outermost layer of the heart, and then there's the parietal, and then there's the fibrous pericardium. So pericardium you need to know, myocardium, yes, and you also need to know endocardium. So on the inside, the part of the heart where blood will be flowing, so that would be this layer here, this needs to be very, very smooth. So throughout the cardiovascular system and all the blood vessels and the heart and the valves even, the surface over which blood flows needs to be very smooth, because anytime blood is flowing and it meets friction, something is interrupting its flow, that creates problems in the circulatory system. So the inside of the heart, if you were to get, let's say, a cow heart, which you can actually buy if you were interested, I think you can get them maybe from butchers, or pig heart, it would all work, you know, any mammal basically. But if you were to cut it open, you'd see that the inside just glistens. And that's because that inner layer, the endocardium, is just really, really smooth. And that endocardium is simple squamous epithelium, the same tissue that is found lining blood vessels. So if you remember from the discussion on blood vessels, arteries have an inner layer, that's the layer that will be touching blood. Veins have an inner layer, also touching blood, and capillaries are just one cell layer thick, and they are simple squamous epithelium. So all of these are actually made of simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so here's the diagram where I'm going to suggest you pause, make a copy of it, and practice labeling it until you know this like the back of your hand. Because on a test, you will be expected to know, if the question is about the aortic valve, where is it? So practice. So let's take a look at all the labels here. So first, let's start with what we said previously. There are two upper chambers. So here is the right atrium. That would be this. Separated from the right ventricle, which is down here. And this is the AV valve, the atrioventricular valve, this white structure here, tethered by what are called chordae tendineae to papillary muscles, the heart muscles here. The right, so let's label right again. So this is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side of the heart, left. The right AV valve, which is this one, has a name, another name, and that's called the tricuspid valve. On the left side, we have left atrium, left ventricle. Notice how thick the wall is for the left ventricle. And this here, separating the atrium from the ventricle, is the left AV valve, which has three names. So it's called the left AV valve, it's called the mitral valve, it's also called the bicuspid valve. Now, those are two valves, so let's put a 1 here. So that's one valve. The tricuspid is the second valve. There are two other valves that are critical to circulation. This one that is shown here, so it sort of looks like a half moon. This is referred to as a semilunar valve, and there are two semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are found at the base of the blood vessels into which blood will go when the ventricles contract. So when the right ventricle contracts, that's this one, blood will be forced up here into this vessel here, which is called the pulmonary trunk. A trunk is just a large vessel. Now this is the pulmonary trunk. It's called the pulmonary trunk because blood will go to the lungs. So oftentimes we can think of the heart as being a double pump. The right side of the heart pumps to the pulmonary circuit. We talked about the pulmonary circuit in the narration on blood vessels. So when blood goes into the pulmonary trunk branches to give you right and left pulmonary arteries, because remember, all arteries carry blood away from the heart. And because we have a right lung and a left lung, we need a left pulmonary artery and we need a right pulmonary artery. Now these arteries are shown in blue because if you remember again, these are the only arteries that carry deoxygenated blood, blood that is rich in carbon dioxide. So this blood has to go to the lungs and the carbon dioxide will diffuse out of blood into the lungs and we will breathe it out. And while the blood is there, it will pick up at the same time oxygen. So when the blood picks up oxygen, so if I could put this in here, so here if I were to put, let's say, the lungs at the top here, lungs, lung capillaries. So this blood here is deoxygenated going in this direction. Gas exchange takes place in the lung capillaries and oxygenated blood flows back to the heart and it will come back here. And there we have the left pulmonary veins, because veins bring blood back to the heart. These are the only veins that carry oxygenated blood. We also have right pulmonary veins, because again we have right and left lung. So coming into the left atrium here is oxygenated blood coming from the lungs. So both the right and the left pulmonary veins will bring oxygenated blood to the left atrium, this area here. That blood will flow through the mitral valve, bicuspid valve, and now it will be in the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, it is going to send blood into the systemic circuit. Remember, the systemic circuit is the circuit where blood is going to flow to the entire body. So the left ventricle is much, much thicker, see its wall, than the right ventricle, because blood has to be pumped here with very high pressure. And it's going to go into this structure here, the aorta. That's the aorta, this massive artery. So at the base of the aorta is where we find the other semilunar valve. So this valve here is a semilunar valve. It's called the aortic semilunar valve. This one here is at the base of the pulmonary trunk, and that's called the pulmonary semilunar valve. So those are the 4 valves. Valves help to regulate blood flow, as we will see. Other important structures, well, we have the veins that bring blood to the heart, the inferior vena cava. So all veins draining organs except the lungs. So from the feet, from the pelvic region, from the abdominal area, the hepatic vein, the renal vein, mesenteric vein, all veins dump their blood into the inferior vena cava. So these are massive, large veins that bring blood to the right atrium. Similarly, the superior vena cava collects blood from all the veins that were carrying blood and draining the head, neck, and the upper part of the thorax. That would be into the superior vena cava, and the superior vena cava also sends its blood into the right atrium. So that's the basic layout. Now, you want to appreciate, because I had said earlier that blood in the right side of the heart does not mix with blood in the left side of the heart. So the division is an interventricular septum. It's a wall. That's what septum means. It's a wall. So this wall here, which is important, has another function, not just the separation of the 2 ventricles. There's also a separation between the 2 atria, but it's difficult to see in a diagram like this. This structure, the fossa ovalis, do not worry about it. It's left over from fetal life. Chordae tendineae, these are strings. They're often referred to as heartstrings. The strings attached to the valves, and they help to regulate the opening and closing of the valves. So blood always flows from atria to ventricles, never in the opposite direction. Always atria to ventricles. And I'm going to try cleaning this off. It's not working. Okay. I think we're done with this for now. We want to take a look at the path of blood flow through the heart. I sort of went over it there, but now we can just focus not on the names of the parts of the hearts, but of the heart, but on the blood flow itself. So let's start with number 1 here. It's a circuit. It's a cycle. Blood flows out to the heart, around the body, comes back to the heart. Whenever we have a cycle like that, we have to start somewhere. And a good place to start is in the right atrium, which is here. So the right atrium is collecting blood from the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava. Here we see the tricuspid valve is open. So the tricuspid valve is open so that blood can flow from the atria into the ventricle. Now, this is the path of blood flow through the heart. This is not actually telling you when the atria contract or when the ventricles contract. That we'll be talking about. This is just the path. Where does it go? So, from the right ventricle, when the ventricle contracts, blood will go into the pulmonary trunk. And from the pulmonary trunk into the right and left pulmonary arteries. So that's the right side of the heart. So remember again, right side is always over here, and this is the left. Now the left side of the heart, what happens on this side? Well, the left pulmonary veins and right pulmonary veins, they will bring blood from the lungs, and that blood will enter the left atrium. Notice that the atria, right and left, are both receiving chambers. They receive blood. Again, the blood has to flow past the mitral valve, or it's also called the bicuspid valve, from the left atrium into the left ventricle with its really thick wall here. From the left ventricle, when the ventricle contracts, blood will go into the aorta. To go into the aorta, it has to pass the aortic semilunar valve. So you will need to know which valves come in contact with oxygenated blood, which valves come in contact with deoxygenated blood, which chambers come in contact with oxygenated blood, which chambers come in contact with deoxygenated blood, and which of these blood vessels that are shown on this diagram, or any of the blood vessels that were listed in the previous narration and slides, which of those come in contact with oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood. So that's a very, very important concept that you must know. And I would really warn you in terms of preparation for the test against trying to think that you can look up all of the information that you will need. Because like I said, there's a lot of learning here. So do yourself a favor and actually learn it. What we see here is the aorta, and we mentioned this would be the brachiocephalic artery, etc. The three arteries that branch off the aortic arch. So this is the arch, and then it bends to go downward, the descending aorta, which is shown as if it's going sort of behind the heart, but that's what this arrow and this structure is meant to represent. So this would be the descending aorta, which now is going basically like down the spine, and it would branch to give us all those arteries going to the thoracic region, the abdominal region, the pelvic region, then down to the lower limbs, etc. So this is another diagram that you should probably stop the narration, ensure you understand this before, moving on. Differences in ventricular muscle thickness. This is an important concept. On the left, we have the ventricles. This again, this is the right side of the heart, this is the left side of the heart, this is the right side, and that's the left side. So this represents the sort of cavity, the space that will accommodate blood, and only the ventricles are shown here in color. So this is showing the thickness of the wall of the left ventricle compared to the right ventricle. And when the heart is relaxed, these ventricles, when they're relaxed, they're filling with blood. Blood will be flowing at the same time from the atria into both of them. When they contract, they're called discharging chambers, because when they contract, they send blood into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta respectively. So the right ventricle will send blood when it contracts into the pulmonary trunk, which is here, and the left ventricle will send blood into the aorta, which is there. So the thickness of the wall, so both ventricles pump the same amount of blood, but the left ventricle must generate a greater pressure to overcome greater resistance in the systemic circuit. Heartstrings. Chordae tendineae of the AV valves and the papillary muscles. In this frontal section, you will see papillary muscles. So these muscles here, the strings, the chordae tendineae, are attached to the papillary muscles. And when the ventricles contract, these muscles also contract. And when they contract, what they do is they keep the cusps of the AV valves closed tight, so that blood cannot back up from a ventricle into the atria. And of course, this is a problem that could occur sometimes in the elderly, that they have faulty valves and the valves don't close properly. So like I said previously, blood should never be flowing backwards. There's one direction only. So looking closer at the heart valves, with the atria and the major vessels removed, all 4 valves are clearly visible, although it is difficult to distinguish the 3 separate cusps of the tricuspid valve. So here, again, here is the right side of the heart, here is the left side of the heart. Right, we've got the right AV valve, which is a tricuspid valve, and you're seeing 1, 2, 3. So that's what the tri in the name comes from. 3 cusps or flaps to the valve. Bicuspid, bi means 2. 2 flaps or cusps to the valve. So this is the left AV valve, also called the bicuspid or mitral valve. Then the semilunar valves are shown here. There's the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve. So the function of the valves now, when the top chambers, which are the atria, contract, the 2 atrioventricular valves will be open, forcing blood into the ventricles. At this time, the 2 semilunar valves remain closed. This is important. Whenever the AV valves are open, the semilunar valves are closed. So remember, the semilunar valves are at the base of those great vessels, the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, which lead, into the ventricles. The bottom right diagram shows a frontal section through the left side of the heart. When the mitral valve is open, so we're over here, it allows blood to move from the left atrium to the left ventricle. The aortic semilunar valve is closed, so here's the aortic semilunar valve. It's closed to prevent backflow of blood from the aorta to the left ventricle. So in other words, the ventricle is only being filled with blood coming from the atria. We don't want blood that was pushed or sent into the aorta to be flowing backwards. So these flaps need to be closed. Now, when the 2 AV valves close, often a heart sound is produced, and the 2 AV valves will close when the ventricles contract. Because when the ventricles contract, blood has to go into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So the semilunar valves will have to be open. So if the semilunar valves are open, we don't want blood backing up into the atria. So whenever the semilunar valves are open, the AV valves are closed. And when the AV valves close, you get what is called lub. So the heart sounds are kind of a lubbed up. So the lub sound is produced by closing of the AV valve. When the bottom ventricles contract, the semilunar valves open, allowing blood to flow into the respective arteries, aorta, pulmonary trunk, which then branches to give you the right and left pulmonary arteries. So now the AV valves have to be closed. So again, when the semilunar valves are open, the AV valves have to be closed to prevent backflow of blood into the atria, the top chambers. So this is what's being shown over here again. So here we have pulmonary valve open and aortic valve open. That's because ventricles are contracting. When ventricles contract, they send blood into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So we need the valves, which are at the base of those two vessels, to be open so the blood will flow into them. At the same time, we need the AV valves to be closed because ventricular contraction is a much higher force, blood pressure, and the blood actually flows up under the AV valves and closes them. And the chordae tendineae, the heartstrings, they are pulled taut. And by doing so, they keep the flaps on those two AV valves nice and tight so that no blood can go back from a ventricle into an atria. So the closing of the semilunar valve produces the other heart sound, which is called the dub sound. So when will the semilunar valves close? The semilunar valves will close when ventricular contraction is finished. So blood has been ejected out of the ventricles into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, and blood has a tendency to want to flow backwards because blood always flows from high pressure to low pressure. But as it flows backward, it flows into the cusps of the semilunar valve and closes them. That's when you hear the dub sound. And while that is happening, the ventricle is slowly starting to relax. It's not completely relaxed yet, but it's just slowly starting to relax. Now, how does the heart know when to beat? So the heart has what is called a conduction system, an electrical conduction system. And so there is a pathway in which this electricity flows, a message basically, and it controls the atria will contract together at the same time, and the ventricles will contract together at the same time. The entire sequence, the entire process takes 0.8 seconds. So if you divide 60 seconds, which is 1 minute, by 0.8 seconds, then you will get the number 75. And that's where we get this number. If you ask anyone number of beats heart per minute, you would get 75 is the average. It's roughly 60 to 75. So what do we have? Well, we have special nervous tissue that is located first in what is called the sinoatrial node. So in the, again, right side and left side. In the right atrium, pretty high up here, in that little corner there, is the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node is called the pacemaker of the heart. It sets the rhythm for how fast or how slow the heart will be beating. So that is very special nervous tissue. Our heart starts beating in fetal life, and it doesn't actually stop. Now, until we die. Now, we can slow down the rhythm, probably through meditation, but basically we don't control it. So let's see. At the top right corner or sinus of the right atrium sits the sinoatrial node, also known as the pacemaker of the heart. That's important. Remember that. The medulla oblongata, so you remember the brain stem. The medulla oblongata was responsible for setting heart rate. So it sends nerve impulses to the SA node to regulate the heart rhythm or contraction. So when the SA node receives this neural message, it sends the electrical impulse to the bottom sinus of the right atrium where the AV node sits. So the message is going from the SA node, where it's initiated, that's a pacemaker, to the AV node. And the AV node is right there at the junction, basically. That's the atrioventricular node. Now, the message, the electrical impulse, also travels across to the left atrium. And when it arrives at the left atrium, both atria will contract and send their blood into the ventricles. So there's a bit of a delay here, slight, but there's a bit of a delay. And so from the AV node, where does it go next? Well, remember that wall that was separating the right from the left? So this is right, this is left, and here is the wall between the two. So between these two, the message goes to the atrioventricular node and into the what is called the right and left bundle branches. So you see the yellow line going there, and then into something called Purkinje fibers. So from the SA node to the AV node, SA node to the AV node, from the AV node, it travels in the atrioventricular bundle, the AV bundle. So the AV bundle used to be called the bundle of His. From the AV bundle, then, it goes into the right and left bundle branches, right and left bundle branches, and then the last place would be the Purkinje fibers, which are in the walls of the ventricles here. So the ventricles contract sort of bottom up. From the bottom starts the contraction first. The bundle branches and Purkinje fibers are essentially the nerves, in quotation marks, of the heart. When these nerves receive the electrical impulse, the ventricles contract both at the same time. So contraction of the heart, has nothing really to do with the amount of blood in it, blood flow. It's based on this electrical stimulation and controlled by the medulla oblongata. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of an ECG, an electrocardiogram. This is nice to know. You should know some parts of it. What is an electrocardiogram? An electrocardiogram shows the electrical conduction of the heart. So it's a very useful piece of information because it looks like a graph. So you see, this is, like one heartbeat. Here's another heartbeat. Well, and then there's another heartbeat and so forth. The pattern that you see here can change if somebody has heart conditions. So this is why on TV shows or even in a hospital, you can see the same ECG, but it looks very different depending on the type of heart condition. So an ECG is used quite often for certain patients. So what do we have? Well, the pattern is kind of named. And so there's this wave that is called a short P wave. And that actually tells you, if it's there, it tells you that the atria are about to contract. If it's flat, you can't see the wave, this little bump there, then that means something's wrong. The big spike, this here, that's called all of this is called the QRS complex and indicates that the ventricles are about to contract. So P wave, atrial contraction, QRS, ventricular contraction. So this is shown by a spike, a very tall spike. There's a lot of electrical conduction occurring in the myocardium. Lastly, the T wave, so this little one at the end here, indicates that the ventricles are recovering from their contraction, because after the ventricles contract, they have to relax. And so contraction is called systole, relaxation is called diastole, right? So here we've got the P wave, and that tells you that the atria are about to contract, so then they contract. And so we have atrial systole. Then QRS, the ventricles are about to contract, so now we have ventricular contraction. Now, when ventricular contraction is happening, the atria are relaxing. So atrial diastole is often hidden by ventricular systole. And then we have the ventricular diastole occurring. So when a chamber contracts, it's called systole. When a chamber relaxes, it's called diastole. At rest, all chambers are in diastole for a brief period of time. When the SA node fires, the atria contract, atrial systole, while the ventricles are relaxed. So remember, the logic of this is that when the atria contract, blood is going to be sent to the ventricles. So the ventricles can't be closed. They have to be open. They have to be relaxed. So the blood will flow into them. And similarly, when the ventricles fill up with blood, they will contract. And when they contract, blood is forced into the great vessels, and the AV valves are closed, so the blood cannot go back into the atria, and the atria in the meantime are collecting, receiving blood. So the cardiac cycle is basically all of the events that occur in one heartbeat. Atrial systole, atrial diastole, ventricular systole, ventricular diastole. Now, I won't be giving you any irregular looking patterns on an ECG on the test, to interpret, because you certainly need to learn much more than this to be able to do so. So what factors can affect heart rate? There is fight or flight, obviously. So the autonomic nervous system, the rest and digest usually means that heart rate is very normal, but if we are, in a fight or flight response, then usually adrenaline, epinephrine, all will cause heart rate to increase, because basically we want more oxygen going to the muscles so that we can run away, escape from danger. There are certain chemicals like caffeine and some drugs that can affect heart rate. Definitely when we exercise, especially aerobic exercise, we increase our heart rate there. That's not a bad thing. That's a very good thing. And in fact, everybody should be getting about 30 minutes of exercise, aerobic activity every single day to keep your heart in good condition. The heart, when we exercise, does get larger because it's a muscle, but that also makes it more efficient at pumping the blood out. And altitude also affects our respiratory system as well as the cardiovascular system, because as we go higher up, if you live in a mountainous area, for example, we tend to assume that we're at sea level here. But if you're living in a mountainous region, there is less O2 in the atmosphere out here. And so one of the accommodations is that you tend to have more red blood cells per drop of blood compared to somebody who is living at sea level. But the other thing is to help with getting more oxygen around the body, because there's less oxygen coming in, is for heart rate to increase. So they may have a slightly higher heart rate. And of course, anxiety will affect heart rate, and so does the hormone involved in stress responses. So the last slide is some questions which I hope you will answer, and if you have any questions about these questions, we can certainly talk about it at the meeting. So that's it for this narration.